It seems that European leaders have now been reduced to scarecrows standing in a field. They are standing there dressed in fine suits, but the real power lies in someone else's hands. Because for the first time since the Cold War, Europe is being given a harsh and clear reminder that its future can still be decided without it. Trump and Putin are quietly preparing a peace framework for Ukraine, and Europe is not present in the room where its own future is being outlined. This exposes a deep humiliation for Europe, and this is not the first time it has happened. Europe has been humiliated many times before. Today, many Europeans are writing on social media that Europeans are becoming irrelevant on their own continent. In today's video, we will talk about Europe's humiliation, how the US and Russia are making decisions about Europe's future, why many European leaders themselves are saying that we are not the drivers of this peace process, we are just passengers, and whether the EU has truly become a wartime scarecrow, big in appearance, but completely ineffective in reality. First, let's understand where this idea of Washington and Moscow deciding Europe's fate actually comes from. Over the past few weeks, several reports have suggested that the US and Russia have been working on a draft peace framework for Ukraine. This draft reportedly lays out, point by point, the lines of a ceasefire, which territory will remain with whom, whether NATO will expand further or not, and what kind of security guarantees Russia will receive. While this draft was being prepared, European capitals were not at the table. The Kyiv Independent and some European newspapers reported that Europe and Ukraine sent their revisions and suggestions to the US only after the draft was prepared, but the original skeleton was developed between Washington and Moscow. In other words, the war is in Europe, the blood being shed is European, the economy affected is Europe's, but the draft deal is between the US and Russia. This is where the narrative of the EU is humiliated begins. Now the question is this talk of humiliation just an over-dramatic YouTube title, or are there real facts behind it? German, French, and other European media themselves have written that while their name is included in the peace talks, they do not have control. Several European diplomats, speaking off the record, have admitted that the actual negotiation architecture is US-led, and that the EU is mostly in reaction mode, meaning someone else is writing the plan, and Europe is merely commenting on it. Some analysts have put it bluntly, Europe built institutions but not hard power. That's why when real war and peace deals have to be written, Washington and Moscow sit at the table, and Brussels holds a press conference afterward. This is exactly why the word humiliation is being used again and again. It is not just an insult, but a reality check that the EU's bargaining power on the ground is far less than it believed itself to be as a geopolitical power. In this entire story, there is a very important but less discussed element: the nearly $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets lying in the EU, the G7, and their banks. Europe had envisioned these assets as a reconstruction fund for Ukraine, money that would be used after the war to rebuild roads, railways, homes, and industry. For Brussels, this was not just leverage, but also a symbol of proving itself as an independent economic power. However, the discussions that emerged around a US-Russia peace framework have created a new fear. If the main political deal is decided between Washington and Moscow, then who will actually decide how these frozen assets are used? Think about it. The money is in European banks. The risk is on the European system. But someone else is deciding when and how this money will be released, which contracts will go to whom, which share will go to US companies, and which to European ones. If this happens, Europe will be reduced to merely a custodian, the keeper of the vault, while political control shifts to Washington. This is the point where the European elite feel the deepest blow, because they see it as a direct attack on economic sovereignty. Now we come to the most sensitive issue in this entire discussion: NATO. On paper, NATO is a military alliance of 32 equal countries, where everyone is supposed to contribute equally. But what is the ground reality? In NATO, the US provides nuclear protection. The US supplies long-range missiles. The US provides intelligence. The US handles logistics support. In contrast, Europe largely provides funding. In other words, the entire backbone of NATO rests on American power. That is why, when a peace framework talks about NATO expansion, future deployments, and Russia-NATO engagement, Moscow speaks directly to Washington. Berlin or Warsaw become secondary players. This is why a line frequently appears in German and European media. Europeans don't have much say in US-run Ukraine peace talks. For decades, Europe comforted itself by saying, "We are equal partners." Not just the United States, but the moment it came time to define real security red lines, the system openly revealed itself. NATO is effectively a one-power alliance, where the final decision is made in Washington. That is why this humiliation is not just symbolic, but a structural reality. Now the question is, what are European capitals doing? On one side, leaders like Macron are saying that if US-led talks fail, Europe will have to engage in direct negotiations with Russia itself. Otherwise, it will be sidelined forever. On the other side, Eastern European countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania are clearly saying that they trust only US security guarantees. They fear that if Paris and Berlin distance themselves from the US in the name of strategic autonomy, the frontline states will once again be left alone in front of Moscow. In other words, two poles are emerging within the EU. One that wants to remain dependent on American leadership, and another that feels that if Europe does not build its own independent security framework now, it will remain a junior partner forever. This panic, this confusion, and this division are the true face of European politics today. On the surface, the language of unity. Underneath, fear and mistrust. Now we come to the core symbol of today's title, Scarecrow in Wartime. In a field, a scarecrow stands upright. From a distance, it looks like a guard, but in reality, it is hollow, made of wood and clothes. Birds are scared for a while, then they realize it is just a fake guardian. Many European thinkers are saying that Brussels' condition today is somewhat similar. Statements, resolutions, sanctions packages, summit photos, all of these together make the EU look like a major power. But when the real questions arise, where will the war stop? On which line will a ceasefire be drawn? Will NATO expand further or not? Will Russian assets be used or not? These decisions are made in meetings between Washington and Moscow, while Brussels merely writes press releases. In other words, the EU is on the field, but the whistle is in someone else's hands. That is why it is being called a wartime scarecrow, visible but powerless. So now the question is, will Europe accept this humiliation forever, or will it actually try to change something? In today's situation, the EU seems to have only two paths in front of it. The first path is permanent strategic subordination, openly accepting that Europe will always depend on the US for its security, that NATO's command will remain in Washington's hands, and that in major decisions, Europe will remain a junior partner. There is comfort in this path, no extra responsibility, no major increase in defense spending, and lower risk. But the cost is losing political adulthood and becoming a second-tier power on its own continent. The second path is a genuine attempt at autonomy, a European army, an independent command structure, its own nuclear and missile policy, a separate industrial base from the US, and most importantly, the courage to endure years of underlying tension with Washington. This path is extremely difficult. Eastern Europe will oppose it, there is a risk of fractures within NATO, but it is the only chance for Europe to once again become the master of its own fate. In simple terms, either comfortable dependency or painful independence. The middle safe zone is rapidly disappearing. So now my direct question to you is this. In this major war of the 21st century, has Europe become a scarecrow in its own home, standing there in a fine suit, but with real power located elsewhere? In your view, which path should Europe choose? Remaining a permanent junior partner alongside the US, or trying to build its own security architecture, even at a cost to itself? Do write your thoughts in the comments. If you liked today's deep dive episode, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with those friends who still understand European politics only in the language of values and democracy, not in the language of power. In the next video, we will raise the question, if Europe truly moves down the path of strategic autonomy, which cracks will appear first within NATO, and what impact will this entire power shift have on India and the global South? Thank you for watching.